In the late 1700s, after almost 300 years of colonization of the New World, the Spanish Empire showed clear signs of institutional decay. King Charles III was determined to reform his empire, and hopefully he would save it. With that in mind, the Marques de Rubi was sent to inspect the northern frontier with an eye to reducing costs and increasing efficiency. His report, though, led to important changes that in fact reduced Spanish military presence in Texas. This was unfortunately for them on the eve of internal conflict within the empire, and as we know, the westward movement of Anglos out of the United States. What changed is that France lost its possessions in North America. This made it clear, as Spain understood, that some reforms were needed. First of all, Spain shared in that defeat. That indicated the effect of widespread corruption. Obviously, the Army and Navy were possibly hopeless, perhaps not as strong as they should have been. More importantly, the loss of Florida, which Spain had to give away because otherwise they were going to have to give up Cuba, which is much more important with its sugar plantations, and maybe even the Philippines. But the loss of Florida led to revenue drops, and the removal of France from North America put a new enemy, the British, on the Spanish northern frontier. Now, Spain and the British, of course, have been fighting each other for almost 200 years, starting with a religious conflict and then moving forward from that into arguments over trade, military power, and ultimately balance of power in the world. Now, Spain, out of this conflict, the Treaty of Paris, did get part of Louisiana, but Britain had bashed France, and perhaps Spain might be next. All of these are things that are going through the minds of Spanish officials, particularly Charles III. Now, Charles III will implement reforms in order to combat the corruption that he thought he saw emerging in the war, to make his government more effective, and to provide better security for his empire. Now, you have to understand who Charles was. Charles is a Bourbon king. That means he's the great-grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He has been in power in Spain since 1759, and he will rule all the way through the American Revolution to 1788. His father was actually installed by Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, as the King of Spain. So there's always going to be that feeling of being an outsider, but also that feeling of being part of a noble family, a enlightened ruler, if you would, that knew best how to do what was necessary to keep an empire together. Unfortunately, during the rule of his father and him, Spain had been defeated repeatedly and had lost territory, often to the British. As an enlightened ruler, he liked to think of himself as a guy who was going to bring Spain forward into the modern era. For example, he banned bullfighting. That did not sit well with many of his constituents, shall we say. What do historians say about him? They actually tend to be very positive towards his reforms, his efforts to modernize, make Spain more efficient, and make it more effective, except for those who are historians of the Catholic Church. This is the ruler of Spain who decided that the Jesuits were a threat and removed the Jesuits from the Spanish Empire, not only on the continent of Europe, but also from Mexico and other places. This is where you get a lot of the conflict that will lead ultimately to the independence of Mexico. So this is a king who has very strong ideas, who wants to bring his empire forward. He has good intentions, but you may have noticed that he is very Eurocentric. He's not very concerned about what's happening out on the peripheries. He's much more concerned about keeping his center, his court, in place and keeping his empire intact. So one of the things he'll do in Mexico, to again give you context for the Marques, is he'll start removing native-born colonial officials in Mexico, the Creoles, and replacing them with new appointees that he sent from the Spanish country itself. We call them peninsulares. They were born and raised on the peninsula. He did this for two reasons. One, he just assumed that if you were born in Spain, you were smarter than anybody else, like him. But second, he also felt that A Peninsulari was likely to be more loyal to his king than someone who might have been born and raised in somewhere like Mexico or Peru or perhaps even the Philippines. Again, a problem emerges. Did they understand what the colonists wanted? Would they understand what the colonies needed? We'll see that again in Texas as well. So, all of these reforms, this change, this efforts by this good-natured, good-intentioned king will be enacted with an idea of making his empire stronger, but maybe not necessarily effective for all parts of the empire, such as Texas, which lay out on the periphery. There were benefits for Texans, for all Creoles everywhere. He will expand the militia. He will expand trade opportunities. But overall, this is going to be a period of retraction, reduction, and ultimately maybe a weakening of Spain's hand on Texas, and that's the context for the Marques de Rubi showing up to do his job.